Mason Whitford never expected the brake failure that nearly killed him to be anything but an accident until he heard his wife and business partner plotting over his hospital bed. Trapped in a mansion filled with enemies, he chose to fake a coma to uncover the truth. What he discovered was darker than betrayal. They wanted him dead and his fortune gone. Mason Whitford had always believed that life, no matter how turbulent, still obeyed a kind of logic. You built a company, you protected your family, you honored the people who stood beside you. In return, you expected the world to give you at least a warning before it shattered everything. But the world gave Mason nothing on the morning it tried to kill him. One moment he was driving along the slick stretch of Interstate 5 that cut through Seattle like a steel vein, thinking about a quarterly report and what he'd cook for the kids that night. The next, his car lurched forward with a violent snap, the brake pedal collapsing beneath his foot as if dissolving into the floorboard. His Tesla hurtled toward the guardrail, tires screaming across the asphalt, and he had just enough time to brace for impact before steel and glass folded around him like a crushing fist. The world didn't fade, it detonated. A blast of pain radiated through his ribs, the taste of copper filled his mouth, and a thunderous ringing drowned out everything except the pounding of his heartbeat. Somewhere in the blur of sirens and emergency lights, Mason remembered thinking that accidents didn't happen to him, he prevented them. He oversaw multi-million-dollar cybersecurity systems, built entire divisions of innovation, and handled crises with a precision most people reserved for surgery. Yet here he was, broken, bleeding, strapped to a stretcher as medics shouted codes over his head. In the hospital, beneath fluorescent lights, far too bright for a man who'd almost died, Mason drifted through waves of pain and fragmented recollections. He could smell disinfectant, hear the shuffle of sneakers on polished floors, and sense the presence of people moving around him. Time felt stretched, distorted, as if hours and minutes were stitched together without any logical pattern. When he finally gained awareness of his surroundings, he didn't open his eyes, he didn't speak. He simply listened, wanting first to understand whether he was alive enough for it to matter. That was when he heard two nurses whispering near his bedside, sorting through charts and exchanging comments that struck him harder than the crash. One of them mentioned Ava, his wife. Not her concern, not her panic, not a single tremble of fear over his condition. Instead, she had asked only about the severity of the injuries and the insurance coverage attached to his name. The nurse sounded disgusted, calling it cold. The other murmured an uncomfortable agreement. And just like that, the logic of Mason's world cracked. Ava had always been distant, yes, but never indifferent to this degree. They had married quickly after the death of his first wife, trying to rebuild a sense of family for his children. Mason had convinced himself he loved her in a way that could grow over time. But hearing her prioritized finances, not him, felt like someone had poured ice water into his chest. Lying there unable to move without sending spears of pain through his torso, Mason realized he had no idea what Ava was capable of. He began replaying conversations, small moments he'd brushed aside. Strange inconsistencies in her explanations for expenses or trips she claimed were for charity galas. He remembered the way she avoided touching him unless there were cameras or guests nearby. He also remembered Logan Pierce, his closest partner in business, visiting their home more often than before. Logan was charismatic, ambitious, always sharper than anyone in the room. Mason trusted him the way a captain trusted his first officer, never once suspecting he could become the iceberg that split the ship. Now, the memory of Logan and Ava laughing a little too comfortably made Mason's stomach twist. When doctors later explained that he would be discharged for at-home care, Mason knew the danger didn't end once he left the hospital. In fact, the hospital might have been the last safe place he had. Every instinct told him something bigger was at play, something orchestrated rather than accidental. So he made a choice that would change everything. He asked Samuel Keaton, an old friend he trusted implicitly, to tell everyone that Mason was barely responsive, drifting in and out, incapable of communication. It was a gamble rooted in desperation but also in strategy. If someone had tried to kill him, they needed to believe they had succeeded. At least for now. Back at the Whitford estate, a sprawling glass and stone mansion overlooking Lake Union, Mason felt like a ghost haunting his own life. The paramedics carried him upstairs to his private suite. Ava didn't bother touching him or offering comfort. She instructed staff where to place the medical equipment and returned to her phone, tapping away as if she were annoyed by the inconvenience. Mason kept his breathing slow, controlled, his eyelids heavy enough to appear unconscious. It wasn't easy. Every muscle begged him to groan, shift, clench his fists, but he refused. If he wanted answers, he would earn them. And answers came faster than he expected. Ava spoke openly in the room, assuming he was too far gone to understand. She mentioned documents, assets, and timelines that didn't sound like the concerns of a grieving wife. She didn't speak about recovery. She spoke about paperwork, estate planning, financial control, all spoken with a strange urgency that didn't match someone whose husband had nearly died. Mason memorized every word, building a map of her intentions even as his body remained motionless. The first real blow came when Ava took a call from Logan Pierce. Believing Mason to be no more aware than a mannequin propped on pillows, she told Logan that Mason looked like a vegetable and that things were moving faster than expected. Logan laughed, a deep, confident tone Mason recognized from countless boardroom victories. That laughter hit Mason harder than the crash. It was confirmation, not suspicion, that the two people he trusted most had forged an alliance behind his back, and not just any alliance. A predatory one. Listening to their conversation, Mason pieced together fragments that suggested the crash wasn't mechanical failure. Logan made a comment about timing, about how the curve should be done the job. Ava complained that Mason surviving complicated their plans. They talked about moving accounts discreetly, removing Mason from legal authority, and making sure the children Noah and Harper would be handled later. Whatever that meant. Mason felt a fury burn inside him so fiercely he had to fight to keep his body from reacting. The betrayal was multilayered, personal, financial, paternal. They had endangered his children. They had tried to erase him. As Mason lay there absorbing the magnitude of their treachery, one truth became undeniable. He was no longer merely recovering from an accident. He was preparing for a war he hadn't known he was fighting. A war for his life, his fortune, and most of all, his children. And the first battle would be fought from this bed, behind closed eyes, inside a house he once believed was his sanctuary. Ava Whitford entered the bedroom long after the paramedics and nurses had finished setting up Mason's monitors and equipment. Her heels clicked across the hardwood floor with the sharp, irritated rhythm of someone inconvenienced rather than worried. She didn't look at him first. She looked at the room, its neatness, the placement of the stand. The fact that someone had moved a vase she liked farther from the window. Only after adjusting those trivial details did she finally glance at her husband lying still on the bed. Her expression wasn't grief. It wasn't fear, it wasn't even confusion. It was annoyance, pure, sharp annoyance that cut through Mason deeper than any injury from the crash. She tapped on her phone, muttering about scheduling conflicts and canceled brunch plans, as if her husband returning home nearly dead had been a minor disruption on her calendar. Mason kept his breathing level, resisting every urge to tense his jaw or furrow his brow. She couldn't know he was aware, not yet. Ava walked to the foot of the bed and gazed at him with the detached curiosity of someone examining a mannequin at a high-end store. She didn't touch his hand or stroke his hair or whisper anything that resembled affection. Instead, she exhaled sharply and said, "This better not drag on." She thought he couldn't hear. She thought he wasn't there. Her voice carried the entitlement of someone who believed she deserved a smoother path, a faster payout, a cleaner ending. And as she turned away from him to take another call, Mason felt the shape of her betrayal settle into something undeniable. Whatever love she had displayed early in their marriage had been performance. Whatever warmth she had offered the kids had been obligatory. Whatever future she claimed she wanted with him had been nothing more than carefully applied makeup over the truth. Her phone buzzed again and Mason recognized the tone. She shifted into soft, sweet, and falsely intimate. It was her public voice, the one she used for social events and charity functions. But this time it wasn't a dunner or designer on the other end, it was Logan Pierce. "He's home," she said in a low tone as she walked toward the corner of the room. "And honestly, Logan, he looks gone. The doctors said he's barely responsive. I don't think he's coming back from this." There was a brief pause. Mason listened, his chest burning, as she laughed quietly at something Logan said. Her laugh had changed since being with Mason, lighter, younger, rehearsed. "I know," she said. "I know it would have been easier if it had just happened instantly. But we work with what we have, right?" Mason memorized every syllable, every careless admission. Ava wasn't simply waiting for him to die. She was frustrated that he hadn't. When she ended the call, she didn't speak to him again. She walked out of the room with her shoulders lifted, poised, confident, like someone who believed the game was already won. Mason wasn't the only one who heard her leave. Down the hall, Alina Ramirez, the housekeeper, waited until she was sure Ava was gone before approaching the room again. Alina peeked in with a worried expression, her eyes softening the moment she saw Mason. She adjusted his blankets gently, brushed a loose strand of hair behind his ear, and whispered a hopeful greeting he had heard every day since returning home. She believed he might still hear her, and Mason held on to those small acts of tenderness like lifelines. He watched through barely parted eyelids as she tidied the nightstand and murmured something about checking on Harper's homework later. Her presence was a balm, but her compassion also made him ache. Alina believed the world had good in it, that people could be saved. Mason now knew better. Later that evening, when the house settled into its nighttime rhythm and the kids were in their rooms, Ava returned again, but not alone. Her voice carried up the stairs before she even entered the doorway. She wasn't trying to be quiet. She wasn't considering that her supposedly unconscious husband might need rest. She was speaking loudly, confidently, to someone following behind her. Logan Pierce entered the room with her. The sight of him tall, polished, wearing the same wristwatch Mason had gifted him for hitting their first $1 billion valuation sent a jolt through Mason's spine. Logan approached the bed with an expression halfway between triumph and disgust, as if seeing Mason in such a helpless state confirmed something satisfying. He nudged the foot of the bed with his shoe, testing for any reaction. Mason didn't move. Logan smirked. "Look at him," Logan said casually, as if Mason were a damaged piece of furniture. The great Mason Whitford. Hard to believe he used to run an empire. Ava folded her arms and leaned against the doorway, watching Logan with a mix of admiration and territorial pride. "He's dead weight," she said. "The doctor claims he could linger like this for months, maybe years. You know how expensive long-term care is going to be." Logan chuckled, pulling a document folder from his coat. "That's why we don't wait years. The faster we get the paperwork through, the better. Once we declare him mentally incompetent, you will gain control of everything. And once that happens, we can restructure the board and transfer assets without the trustees raising questions." Mason's stomach tightened. They weren't just taking the company, they were dismantling his legacy piece by piece. And they were planning it inside his bedroom as if he were already gone. Ava sighed dramatically, flipping her hair back. "He should be died in the crash." "Logan, you said." Logan held a hand up, annoyance flashing in his eyes. "I said the adjustments to the brakes would cause a failure. I didn't say the man was guaranteed to die. He must have swerved at just the right moment." The confession stabbed through Mason like a blade. Logan had sabotaged the car. The crash hadn't been fate or misfortune. It had been engineered. Logan leaned closer to the bed, lowering his voice with arrogance. "But he's as good as gone. And the public sympathy will work in our favor. You'll be the grieving wife. I'll step in to stabilize the company. In a few months, no one will question anything." Ava's expression shifted into something hungry, ambitious, almost predatory. "And the kids?" she asked. Logan shrugged. "Boarding school, somewhere far, somewhere expensive. You'll maintain the image of being a devoted stepmother, but we don't need them complicating things." Mason forced his muscles to remain relaxed even as rage surged through him like wildfire. His children were not obstacles. They were everything. Ava and Logan spoke for nearly half an hour, detailing plans, discussing fund transfers, naming attorneys who could be bribed, and mapping out the timeline for pushing Mason out of his own empire. When they finally left, turning off the lights behind them, Mason lay in the darkness, absorbing every word. The betrayal was absolute. It wasn't only Ava, it wasn't only Logan, it wasn't only greed. It was the realization that they had plotted to erase him completely, his business, his identity, his relationship with his children, and craft a future built on his absence. As the house grew quiet again, Mason stared upward, the faint glow of the moon cutting across the ceiling. The crash hadn't been the end. It was the beginning of the longest, coldest fight of his life. And he would win it not by confronting them now, but by waiting, watching, and using their arrogance against them. In their eyes he was gone, in reality he was preparing to rise. The morning after Ava and Logan revealed more than they ever intended, the Whitford mansion settled into its usual routine, but for Mason, everything felt sharpened, louder, heavier. Even the distant murmur of traffic rolling up from the lake seemed different, as if the world outside had no idea that inside this house. Betrayal sat at the breakfast table drinking imported coffee. Mason lay perfectly still while footsteps moved across the hallway, identifying each person by rhythm. He could distinguish Ava's impatient strides, Logan's confident gait on the days he intruded without invitation, and the soft, careful steps that belonged only to Alina Ramirez. Hers were the only ones he welcomed, the only ones that eased the constant tension that coiled through his damaged muscles. His children's footsteps used to echo with a lightness that made the house feel alive, but now their movement was hushed, cautious. They had been instructed, conditioned not to disturb their father, not to run into the room they once used as a hiding place during games of tag. Mason knew Ava had spun some story about the dangers of startling a recovering patient. That was the charitable version. More likely, she didn't want them near him because kids had instincts. They saw truth before adults did. They might notice something she didn't want anyone to notice, that Mason Whitford was far from gone. No's voice drifted faintly from the hallway, a small whisper asking if he could peek inside. Harper's softer reply urged him not to. They both paused outside the door, breathing shallowly, then moved away. Mason felt something inside him twist, not pain from the injuries but pain from the distance growing between him and the two people he loved more than anything. He wanted to sit up, open his arms, let them know their father was still here, still fighting. But acting now would ruin everything. Acting now would risk their safety, so he stayed still, breathing evenly, waiting for the one person who hadn't abandoned him. Alina entered quietly a few minutes later, carrying a tray with water, medication, and a fresh towel folded with military precision. Her face was tired, as if she'd cried recently, but she still greeted him with the warmth of someone who refused to let cruelty define her day. She spoke gently as she adjusted the blanket, unaware that every word was being absorbed and cherished. Alina had always been steady, reliable, the kind of presence that anchored a drifting room, but now Mason saw her differently. She wasn't merely a housekeeper. She was a guardian of the fragments of his family that still had hope. She was the last barrier between his children and the emotional frost Ava spread through the home. Watching her move around the room with such quiet competence helped Mason understand how much he had overlooked while he was consumed with work. He had entrusted his children's atmosphere to the wrong woman. Ava ran the household in name, but Alina ran it in spirit. After checking his temperature and ensuring the medical devices looked untouched, Alina stepped back and studied him with concern. "You look a little better today, Mr. Whitford," she murmured. "The kids will be happy to hear that." Mason wanted to respond, to lift a finger or even blink in gratitude, but he held the line. Alina smiled sadly, smoothing the corner of the blanket, and Mason felt a surge of protectiveness rise within him. She didn't deserve the life she was carrying, the financial strain, the long hours, the emotional labor of raising two children who weren't hers while worrying about her own daughter's survival. I've dismissed her as staff. Mason saw her now as something far greater, an unexpected anchor in the storm of his life. Later that afternoon, Ava appeared again, this time with a notebook in hand and a pair of reading glasses she rarely wore unless she was signing something she considered important. She walked right past Mason without looking at him and sat at the small desk near the window. The click of her pen echoed against the glass walls. "We need to expedite everything," she muttered into her phone. "The board is expecting answers. Logan says it will take at least a week to finalize the transfer." She paused. "I know, but the sooner this is over, the better. He can't linger like this forever." Mason's jaw tightened. She spoke of him the way a landlord might talk about a broken appliance, an inconvenience, a burden. Her impatience for his condition wasn't born of grief or exhaustion. It was born of greed. She left after 15 minutes, not bothering to check if he needed anything, not even pretending. When the door clicked shut, the room felt different. Heavy but clear. Her intentions were no longer guesses or interpretations. They were fact, and facts could be used as weapons. Mason's mind, dulled earlier by trauma and painkillers, was now sharpening with purpose. If Ava believed he was slipping away, she would lower her guard. If Logan believed the crash had nearly finished the job, he would get careless, and careless people made mistakes. That night, when Alina returned to tidy up before heading home, Mason felt the urge to reach out. He held it back again, but imagined the moment he would tell her everything, how much he needed her loyalty, how much he trusted her without ever having said the words. Her compassion was the only thing that kept the mansion from sliding entirely into the cold abyss Ava created. Alina hummed softly while adjusting his pillow, a melody Mason didn't recognize but found comforting. She always spoke gently about the children, promising him they were being cared for, updating him on their schoolwork, their drawings, their worries. Harper had made a picture of the lake that morning. No had read a chapter of a book he thought his dad would like. The details were small, but they kept Mason alive inside the prison of stillness he'd built. When Alina turned to leave, she paused at the doorway, looking back at him with a flicker of something deeper, concern mixed with hope. "I'll be back early tomorrow," she said softly. "You're not alone here." And then she left, unaware of how greatly her words steadied him. As night settled over the property, the mansion seemed to exhale, its lights dimming, its rooms cooling into quiet spaces where secrets could hide. Mason lay in the darkness, replaying Ava's conversations, Logan's arrogance, the kids' hushed voices, and Elena's kindness. The truth sat fully formed now. The home he built had become a battlefield, and the people walking its halls were players in a war he hadn't known he was fighting. But now he was awake, and he had something they didn't time: information, and a resolve forged from betrayal. The crash may have fractured his bones, but it had awakened his instincts. and as he listened to the faint hum of the machines beside him, Mason knew that the moment he rose would be the moment the balance of power shifted forever. The revelation that Logan Pierce had sabotaged the brakes on his Tesla replayed in Mason Whitford's mind with a vividness that felt almost physical. Every detail of the crash, the violent swerve, the grinding metal, the helpless slide toward the guardrail now made horrifying sense. The randomness he'd accepted for days evaporated, replaced by the cold awareness that another man had decided his life was expendable. That man had once celebrated victories with him, toasted with him after long negotiations, promised loyalty as they signed documents that tied their futures together. Logan had been the friend who knew the passwords to Mason's office vault, the details of every acquisition, and the vulnerabilities of the empire they'd built. Now Mason realized that the knowledge Logan gained as an ally had become ammunition against him. It wasn't simply betrayal. It was calculated extermination. Lying motionless in his bed, Mason let the weight of that truth settle into something sharper than fear. Fear was temporary. What he felt now was resolve. Logan and Ava believed they had created the perfect crime, a mechanical malfunction staged on a rainy Seattle morning. A husband who didn't die but instead returned home as a bedridden phantom, and a window of time they assumed would allow them to dismantle everything he had built. Their confidence was astonishing, their arrogance even more so. They talked openly, comfortably, believing the man they tried to murder was too far gone to hear a single word. And that arrogance was going to be the first crack he would exploit. He replayed Logan's voice in his mind, that smug, low tone that used to command boardrooms but now dripped entitlement and satisfaction. "I made the adjustments," Logan had said. "The curve should be done the job." Hearing those words had shifted something permanently inside Mason. Before, he had believed himself trapped, injured, isolated, surrounded by enemies. Now he realized he was the most underestimated person in the house. Every second he remained unconscious was a second his enemies revealed more. The danger was real, but the advantage was his. Ava's role in the conspiracy no longer surprised him. Her apathy, her coldness, her irritation at his survival, they painted a clear portrait of a woman who valued image and luxury above everything. She wanted the estate, the company, the access to wealth without the burden of the man who created it. Logan wanted power. Together, they made a pair dangerous enough to orchestrate a murder and call it a business decision. But even they had not accounted for the strength that comes from survival. Mason wasn't dead, he wasn't dying. He wasn't weak. He was learning the playbook of his enemies, while they assumed he couldn't even hear. As the afternoon sun shifted across the wall, casting long shadows over the room, Mason forced his thoughts to grow strategic rather than emotional. Rage would destroy him if he let it take control. He needed to think like the CO. He was analytical, patient, methodical. The crash had taken his mobility, his sense of safety, and temporarily his voice. But it hadn't taken the one asset that mattered most, his mind. And with that, he began mapping out the first phase of his counterattack. Observe, he would gather, he would wait. Knowledge was going to be his weapon long before the law or any confrontation came into play. He listened as Logan visited the house again later that day, tracking the cadence of his footsteps and the shift of his tone depending on whether he was speaking to Ava or the household staff. Logan carried himself like a man who already believed he owned the place. He asked questions about the mail deliveries. He inspected one of the meeting rooms as if measuring it for future renovations. Ava followed behind him, offering her opinions about decor, about what she wanted removed once Mason was gone, about how excited she was to turn the house into something that finally fit her lifestyle. Their casual cruelty stung, but it also helped Mason understand what motivated them: entitlement twisted into ambition. Logan's confidence was especially revealing. When he spoke about company matters, he had already begun referring to decisions in the future tense, assuming he would soon hold Mason's position. He outlined budget relocations, board reorganizations, and upcoming acquisitions with the comfort of a man discussing weekend plans. He wasn't worried. He wasn't cautious. He believed Mason had been eliminated as a threat. That unchecked certainty made Logan dangerous, but it also made him sloppy. Mason committed every detail to memory: the bank names Logan referenced, the shell companies he mentioned, the timeline he and Ava discussed for filing legal motions. He would reproduce each detail later, when the time came to build a case that would destroy them both. For now he remained still, his breath steady, his eyes half closed. Every passing minute affirmed that his choice to fake vulnerability was the smartest move he had ever made. When Logan eventually stepped into the bedroom doorway, Mason felt his pulse rise but kept every muscle lax. Logan studied him with a smirk that carried no respect, no regret, not even fear. "Hard to believe this is the guy who used to run half the city," Logan said, voice low and amused. Life comes at you fast. Mason absorbed the words without reacting, using them as fuel. Logan leaned closer, examining Mason's face as if searching for signs of life. When he found none, he grinned and turned away. "He's done," Logan said over his shoulder to Ava. "We re in the clear." The phrase cut into Mason with brutal precision. In the clear, they genuinely believed no consequences existed for them. They believed the world belonged to those bold enough to take what they wanted. They believed Mason Whitford, the man who built an empire from nothing, was gone forever. And they were wrong. After they left, the room settled into an oppressive stillness that allowed Mason to think freely. He weighed every angle. He needed evidence, not just overheard conversations, but hard proof, something legal teams couldn't bury, something prosecutors couldn't ignore. He needed allies, people he could trust, and he needed time. The act of being bedridden trapped him physically, but it gave him a vantage point Yvonne and Logan never anticipated. He was the invisible witness to their plans, the man they had underestimated into becoming their biggest threat. As night approached, Mason felt a shift, not in the house, but inside himself. Before he'd been surviving, now he was preparing. Logan's admission had given him more than fear or fury. It had given him clarity. The attempted murder wasn't the end of his story. It was the beginning of a calculated mission to reclaim everything that was his and ensure that the two people who betrayed him would never have another opportunity to hurt him, his children, or anyone else. Mason's eyes remained closed, his body unmoving, but for the first time since the crash, he felt powerful. He wasn't helpless. He wasn't defeated. He was gathering ammunition, piece by piece, waiting for the moment he could rise, not as a victim, but as the man prepared to bring an empire of lies crashing down on the heads of the people who built it. The hardest part of Mason Whitford's fade was not the physical restraint or the stillness that strained his battered muscles. It was hearing his children know and Harper hesitate outside his door, their young voices strained with confusion and fear they didn't deserve. Before the crash, the kids had filled the house with life. Every morning began with Harper bounding into the kitchen for pancakes and Noah urging Mason to help with a science project before school. Their laughter had always traveled effortlessly through the hallways. Now, their steps were delicate, like they were afraid of waking something dangerous inside the room instead of visiting their father. Ava had done that. She hadn't just pushed them away from him, she'd infected their world with uncertainty. That morning, Noah's voice was clearer than usual, drifting in through the crack beneath the door. "Do you think he'll get better?" He whispered. "He doesn't move." Harper answered with a tremor in her words, the way she did when she tried to sound brave but couldn't quite manage it. "Ava said he needs quiet. She said we can't go unless she says so." Hearing his daughter speak his wife's name with that tone, wary, obligated, made Mason's heart ache. He wanted to tell them the truth, that Ava had no authority to dictate their love, that her rules were built on selfishness, not concern. But to protect them, he remained still, even as his son's questions sliced through him like a blade. When their footsteps faded, replaced by the distant hum of their tablets or homework routine, Mason felt the loss of their presence like a physical weight on his chest. Before the accident, he had been busy, too busy, sometimes meetings, investors, acquisitions. He convinced himself that providing for them was the same as being there for them. Now that he was stuck in this bed, his biggest regret was that the world he'd built for their security had made them vulnerable in ways he never imagined. Ava didn't nurture, she controlled. She didn't comfort, she corrected. And now, with Mason out of the picture, she had no reason to pretend otherwise. Later that day, he heard Harper crying in the hallway. Ava's voice followed, sharp and cutting, chastising her for leaving toys on the stairs, claiming they were a hazard. It wasn't about safety. It was about finding something, anything to exert authority over. Mason listened helplessly as his daughter tried to apologize through tears, her words stumbling over one another. He had never heard Harper sound afraid in her own home. The realization made something cold and determined settle deeper in Mason's chest. Whatever came next, whichever steps he took toward exposing Ava and Logan, his children would be at the center of it. Their safety, their happiness, their freedom from this oppressive environment, it wasn't optional. It was the mission. A few minutes later, Alina's voice appeared, soft and steady, the way sunlight breaks through a heavy morning fog. She comforted Harper, wiping her tears and telling her that she'd help pick up the toys, that no one should yell over something so small. Mason couldn't see this moment, but he pictured it with heartbreaking clarity, a kind woman kneeling to meet a child's eye level, giving her what Ava refused to offer, comfort. Alina had become the parent the children relied on without ever meaning to, and Ava resented her for it. That afternoon, Mason heard another exchange that deepened the fracture in his heart. Noah stood in the doorway of his room, mumbling that he wished he could show his dad the model plane he built. It was something he and Mason had started together weeks before the crash. Mason used to explain lift and drag principles with a calm enthusiasm that Noah adored. Now the boy hesitated to even talk about the project out loud. Alina encouraged him to keep building, promising that his father would want to see it when he woke up. Noah didn't respond, but Mason could hear the small sniffle he tried to hide. That tiny stifled sound broke him more than any cracked rib. Ava dismissed these emotions the same way she dismissed anything that didn't serve her. She had lunch delivered to her room and carried on a phone conversation about a weekend getaway with Logan, discussing restaurants in Vancouver as if her stepchildren weren't quietly grieving downstairs. When Harper asked if she could draw a picture for her dad, Ava's response was dismissive. "He won't see it," she said. "Not right now, maybe later, as if love were something that could be placed on a waiting list, as if a child's attempt at comfort were an inconvenience. Mason's hands twitched faintly beneath the blankets, a reflex he suppressed instantly. His anger simmered in silence, not the impulsive kind but a controlled burn that would fuel every decision he'd make in the days ahead. By evening, Alina reappeared, bringing the kids into the room while Ava showered. She closed the door gently behind them, her tone hushed but warm. "Just for a moment," she told them, "tell him about your day. It helps him, even if he can't talk yet." Harper climbed onto the edge of the mattress, placing a drawing on his chest, a picture of the lake behind their house, colored too brightly, the way children do when trying to paint hope into something uncertain. Noah stayed by the nightstand holding the model plane with careful hands, explaining its new wings in a soft, wavering voice. Mason wanted to reach out, to sit up, to embrace them, to promise that their world wasn't irreparably damaged. But the act wasn't over, the danger wasn't gone. Ava could return at any second. So he remained motionless, letting their voices wash over him like a promise he intended to keep. When Alina ushered them out gently, whispering that they'd return tomorrow, Mason felt a clarity he hadn't had since before the accident. Ava didn't simply want him gone. She wanted ownership of everything: his company, his reputation, his wealth, and now, even his children's trust. She wanted to reshape the house into a reflection of herself, free from any reminder of Mason's presence. But she was too focused on money and power to understand that the real foundation of the Whitford family was built on love, something she neither valued nor understood. She believed the kids could be molded into obedient figures who fit her curated life, but children are perceptive in ways adults often forget. They saw through her coldness, they felt the absence of genuine care. And Mason realized with full certainty that if he didn't act soon, Ava would damage them emotionally in ways far worse than anything she had done to him physically. That night, lying in a room filled with shadows stretching across the ceiling, Mason made another vow. Ava and Logan thought they had removed him from the picture. They believed the children were pliable, that they could rewrite the narrative of the family without consequence. But they underestimated the depth of a father's love. Mason wasn't just fighting for vengeance anymore. He was fighting for the souls of his children. And he would not let them grow up in a house poisoned by manipulation and indifference. He would rise. He would protect them, and he would make sure Ava never touched their hearts or their future again. Alina Ramirez had always been a steady presence in the Whitford home, the kind of person who made the mansion feel warmer simply by walking through it. But since the accident, her role had quietly transformed into something far more significant. She was no longer just the housekeeper, she had become the emotional backbone of the family. The sole source of comfort for two children who had been left drifting in the wake of their father's supposed decline and their stepmother's tightening coldness. To Mason, who remained trapped in the performance of unconsciousness, Alina's kindness wasn't just noticeable, it was essential, grounding him during the darkest days of his silent war. Every morning, Alina entered the room with the same gentle routine, adjusting the blinds so the light wouldn't hit Mason's eyes directly, straightening the blankets with care, and whispering greetings that he clung to like a lifeline. While Ava barely acknowledged his existence, Alina treated him as if his mind were fully awake and listening, speaking to him as though he were still the man who held authority, pride, and dignity. Mason listened, absorbing her warmth as she updated him on the kids' breakfast conversations, school worries, and small victories. He felt seen in a way Ava had never allowed. What struck Mason most wasn't simply her compassion toward him, it was the fierce devotion she showed Noah and Harper. The children gravitated to her like flowers seeking sunlight, their voices softening with trust the moment she approached. Alina had a way of bending down to their level, making eye contact that told them she wasn't just hearing them. She was understanding them. She carried out breakfasts Ava never bothered to check, helped with homework Ava never noticed, and offered comfort Ava never gave. These gestures weren't grand, they were simple and human, but in a house ruled by Ava's emotional distance, their impact was enormous. One afternoon, Mason heard Harper timidly approach Alina in the kitchen, her little voice trembling with worry. "Is Daddy gonna wake up?" she asked, unsure whether she was allowed to ask the question at all. Ava had kept them away so effectively that even wondering aloud had become an act of rebellion. Alina stopped washing dishes and turned to Harper, drying her hands on a towel before kneeling to meet her eyes. "Your daddy is strong," she said, "stronger than you think. He's fighting every day to come back to you." The girl exhaled shakily, leaning forward until Alina wrapped her arms around her. Mason imagined the moment through sound alone, but he felt its sincerity through every word. When Noah joined them, Alina asked about school, the friends he no longer spoke about, and the model plane he had built. The house had been too tense lately for him to enjoy anything, but he brightened when Alina brought up the project. "I added bigger wings," he said, suddenly animated. "I think Dad will like it." Alina smiled and ruffled his hair. "Of course he will. He's going to be so proud of you." That affirmation, spoken with such confidence, soothed Mason more than any pain medication ever had. She was holding his children's hearts together while he lay helpless, something Ava not only refused to do but openly resented. Ava's treatment of Alina made that painfully clear. Whenever she crossed paths with the housekeeper, her words were curt and sharp, as if Alina's kindness personally offended her. She would criticize the way toys were stored, complain about insignificant smudges on counters, and nitpick anything she could use to reassert control. Alina accepted the barbs with a calm Mason admired. She didn't cower, she didn't argue. She simply let Ava's venom slide off her and continued her work with grace. Mason suspected Ava lashed out at Alina because she recognized a threat, not a physical one, but a moral one. Where Ava brought emptiness into the home, Alina brought life. Where Ava viewed the children as burdens, Alina viewed them as blessings. And where Ava used power to manipulate, Alina used compassion to heal. One evening, the contrast between them became painfully sharp. Harper had fallen asleep on the couch, exhausted from a poor night's rest and too many hours of worrying about her father. When Ava walked in and saw the child sleeping, she didn't pause to tuck her in or carry her gently to her room. Instead, she snapped at Alina, demanding to know why Harper wasn't in bed and complaining about mess and noise. Harper jolted awake in confusion, eyes wide with fear. Alina immediately stepped in, soothing her, brushing hair from her face, telling her everything was fine. Ava rolled her eyes and walked away, annoyed by the display of tenderness she couldn't understand. Mason heard every word, every raised tone, every soft reassurance Alina offered. The pain of remaining still during those moments nearly broke him. He wanted to get up, to hold his children close and tell Ava she would never speak to them that way again. But patience was the weapon he needed now. If he moved too soon, Ava and Logan would finish what they started. They would try again. They would succeed next time. So he let his anger simmer beneath the surface, saving it for the moment it would matter most. Another day, Mason overheard a quieter moment, one that redefined how he saw Alina entirely. Harper had drawn another picture for him, this one of their family standing beside the lake. She had drawn Ava smaller than everyone else, her figure placed far off to the side. When Alina noticed, she gently asked why. Harper shrugged. "Because she doesn't like us," she admitted. "She likes her phone and her dresses and her friends, but she doesn't like us." Alina didn't correct her or try to soften the truth. Instead, she chose different words, words of empowerment. "Sometimes grown-ups forget how to show love," she said carefully. "But you and Noah are wonderful kids, and you are loved, very loved." Mason soaked in those words, knowing she was speaking for him. At the same time, he started noticing how Ava's resentment grew. Whenever she saw Alina comforting the kids, she scowled. Whenever Alina spent a moment too long in Mason's room, she interrogated her. Ava had built her power through intimidation, but Alina never gave her the reaction she wanted. She continued to treat Mason with dignity, the kids with affection, and even the house with respect. Mason realized that by simply being good, Alina was dismantling Ava's illusion of control. In those days, Alina became something else for Mason, a reminder of the home he wanted to build, not the one Ava had created. Watching her nurture his children convinced him that kindness was not weakness, it was strength, it was loyalty. And in a house collapsing under deception, her presence was a beam of light carving through the shadows. He began planning not only how to expose Ava and Logan, but how to protect the woman who had unknowingly become his family's guardian. Alina had risked her job, her peace, and her emotional well-being for his children. When the storm broke, Mason would make sure she never faced another day of fear. Because while Ava saw Alina as replaceable staff, Mason saw her for what she truly was, the heart of the Whitford home, and the one person he would trust with everything he had left. Mason had always respected Alina's quiet resilience, but it wasn't until he heard the edge of exhaustion in her voice one late evening that he realized how much weight she carried behind her calm exterior. The mansion was unusually still that night. Ava had gone out for dinner with friends, though Mason suspected she was meeting Logan, and the kids were tucked into bed after a long day of school and emotional strain. Alina lingered in his room longer than usual, tidying up and checking the monitors even though she wasn't medically trained. She did it because she cared, because no one else in that house did. As she moved around the room, Mason heard a small, stifled breath, the kind a person makes when holding back the overwhelming. The sound tightened something in his chest, partly because he recognized it from himself, and partly because it didn't belong in the voice of someone who had spent every day giving comfort to others. It was only when her phone buzzed in her apron pocket, its vibration sharp in the quiet room, that her composure cracked. She stepped back into the corner, answering in a hushed tone she assumed he couldn't hear. "Is she okay?" Alina asked, voice trembling. "Did they run the tests?" Mason listened, unable to move but intensely focused on every word. The reply on the other end was faint, but Alina's reaction told him everything. She gasped softly, covering her mouth as if to contain her fear. "I'll figure something out," she whispered. "Just make sure she's not scared. Tell her I love her. I'll be there as soon as I can." The call ended with Alina leaning against the wall for a moment, gathering herself before returning to Mason's bedside with the same gentle movements as always. But the heaviness didn't leave her. It followed her steps, sagging her shoulders and draining the warmth from her voice. Mason had underestimated how much he had come to depend on Alina's emotional steadiness. Seeing it crack, even if only in her breathing, shook him. When she tucked the blanket around him, he noticed her hands trembling. He wanted to reach out and reassure her, to pull her into conversation, but doing so would risk everything he had been building quietly over the last several days. Instead, he lay there helplessly, forced to absorb the painful truth that the woman giving everything to his family was quietly losing something irreplaceable in her own. The next morning, the truth became clearer. Alina arrived later than usual, looking tired in a way makeup couldn't hide. Her eyes were rimmed red, her movements slightly slower. She apologized under her breath, even though no one in that house, not Ava, not the staff, not the children, deserved an apology from her. She went straight to work, tending to breakfast, organizing the kids' backpacks, and checking on Mason. As she adjusted his pillows, she whispered, "I'm sorry if I woke you last night." The irony nearly made Mason exhale. She was apologizing to a man she believed couldn't hear her while silently breaking under the weight of her daughter's illness. Throughout the day, Mason began noticing more details that hinted at a struggle she'd been hiding for longer than he realized. Alina took calls only when no one was watching. She stepped into storage rooms or empty hallways, her voice tight and controlled. He heard fragments: medical bills, insurance problems, hospital visits, specialists in Seattle who couldn't give clear answers. The name Luna was repeated often, always with a tone of longing and fear. Mason pieced together the story: the late night shifts, the constant rushing, the exhaustion she never complained about. Her daughter wasn't just sick. She was running out of time, and Alina was running out of options. What struck Mason wasn't just the tragedy of the situation. It was how invisible it was to the woman who considered herself the matriarch of the household. Ava had no idea. Or worse, she didn't care. In fact, that afternoon, Mason heard another biting exchange from just outside the room. Ava had criticized Alina for leaving early the previous day to visit Luna in the hospital. "Your personal drama can't interfere with your duties," Ava said coldly. "If you can't handle the workload, I'll find someone who can." Alina apologized again, quietly, respectfully, though exhaustion wavered in her voice. Ava dismissed her with a wave, already returning to a different phone call. That moment hardened something in Mason that had been forming ever since the crash, the conviction that Ava lived in a world where empathy was a useless currency. People mattered only when they glorified her life or benefited her ambition. Alina, who gave more to the Whitford household than Ava ever had, was treated as disposable. Mason had never been blind to Ava's selfishness, but now he saw the full scope of her cruelty, and it aggravated his desire to dismantle her illusions of power. Later that evening, when the kids visited his room with drawings and soft, hopeful voices, Mason noticed how Alina lingered in the doorway, forcing a smile for their sake. When Harper hugged her waist, thanking her for helping with her art project, Alina blinked back tears. Not because she was overwhelmed, but because Harper's innocent affection reminded her of what she feared losing forever. Luna wasn't much younger than Harper. The reality of that comparison was written across Alina's face in a way only a parent could recognize. Once the children left, Alina remained behind, placing a warm cloth on Mason's forehead. She spoke softly, as she always did, but there was a quiver beneath her words. "You'll be okay," she murmured. "Everyone's praying for you. The kids need you." Her voice cracked on the last sentence, and she pressed a hand to her face, exhaling shakily, "Luna needs me too. I don't know how to be in two places at once." She didn't expect an answer. She didn't think anyone heard, but Mason absorbed every syllable like it was oxygen. And it was in that moment more than any betrayal from Ava or Logan that Mason made a vow that reshaped the path ahead. Alina had protected his children with unwavering loyalty. She had protected Mason himself without knowing he could hear her. She had kept the house from collapsing entirely under Ava's emotional tyranny. She had given everything while receiving nothing in return. Mason realized he couldn't simply repay her with gratitude when he eventually revealed the truth. He needed to save her daughter. He needed to give Alina back the hope she had been losing day by day. He needed to show her that kindness still had power in a world ruled by people like Ava and Logan. When she left the room that night, Mason lay in the dim glow of the bedside lamp, the steady rhythm of the monitors echoing his growing determination. He wasn't just surviving for himself anymore. He wasn't just planning to bring down the people who wanted him dead. He was fighting for the children who needed him. He was fighting for Alina, who had given his family stability when he couldn't. And he was fighting for Luna, a girl he had never met, but who had already become part of the future he intended to build once he stood up again. In that moment, Mason understood that loyalty didn't come from contracts or business alliances. It came from people like Alina. People who loved without conditions. People who stayed even when the world tried to push them out. Ava and Logan had underestimated him, but they had also underestimated Alina. And in doing so, they had underestimated the strength of the bond forming quietly between them, a bond that was about to become the most powerful weapon Mason had. Mason had rehearsed the moment in his mind countless times before it finally arrived, the moment he would break the illusion he had so carefully constructed and reach out to the only person in that house who had earned his trust. He had waited for the perfect alignment of circumstances: Ava gone, the children asleep, Logan off the property, and Alina's guard momentarily lowered by exhaustion and quiet despair. He had spent days listening, analyzing, absorbing every detail of her struggle. He knew the weight she carried, the desperation she tried to hide, and the love that kept her standing. And he knew with unshakable certainty that if anyone deserved the truth, it was Alina Ramirez. That night she entered his room long after dinner, her steps slower than normal, her posture subtly slumped. The air carried the faint scent of hospital antiseptic leftover from the scarf she'd worn to visit Luna earlier. She didn't turn on the overhead lights, only the soft lamp on the nightstand, casting warm, golden shadows across the room. She approached his bed with her usual gentleness, adjusting the monitor wires, smoothing out the blanket, and checking the chart Keaton left. But tonight there was no soft humming, no quiet updates about the kids, no encouraging words. Instead, she sank slowly into the chair beside him, pressing her palms to her eyes as if holding back tears she could no longer swallow. Mason watched through half-lidded eyes, the tension in his chest growing unbearable. She whispered, voice raw, "I don't know what else to do." The words were barely audible, cracked open by fear. "They said the treatment is her best chance, but I can't afford it. Not even close. I'm losing her, and I can't let that happen." She wiped her face with the sleeve of her sweater, trying to collect herself, but the effort only made her look smaller. "I'm so tired," she whispered. "I'm trying to be strong for everyone, but I'm so tired." Her voice broke on the last word, and she leaned her head into her hands. That was the moment Mason couldn't watch silently any longer. All the restraint, the calculations, the strategy, everything fell away in the face of a mother breaking apart for love. He shifted his fingers first, a small movement but intentional. Alina didn't notice. She was too lost in her pain. He swallowed, forcing strength into his throat, and whispered her name, Alina. The sound was hoarse, rasping, barely audible, but unmistakably real. Alina's head jerked up, eyes wide with shock. She stared at Mason, frozen, as if she believed the room itself had played a cruel trick. Mason gathered his strength, forcing his lips to move again. "Alina, I hear you." She stood abruptly, stepping back, one hand covering her mouth, the other reaching for the bed rail to steady herself. Relief, confusion, fear, all of it raced across her face in quick succession. "Mr. Whitford," she whispered, voice trembling. "Are you? Can you?" Mason nodded weakly. "I've been awake, just not able to show it. Not yet." Alina's breaths came uneven and shallow. She looked at the door, then back at him, overwhelmed by the weight of this revelation. "You've been listening." Mason met her gaze with a seriousness that anchored the moment to everything. For a long stretch of silence, Alina didn't move. Then, slowly, she approached him again, her steps still wary, as if she were approaching a man who had risen from the dead. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" she asked, her voice cracking. Mason's response was quiet but resolute. "Because Ava and Logan tried to kill me, and they were planning to finish what they started." Alina's eyes widened with horror, tears forming again, not from her own struggle this time, but from realizing the magnitude of the danger surrounding them all. "My God," she whispered. "How can someone—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Mason continued, voice steadier now as he reclaimed pieces of himself he'd been forced to hide. "I don't know who else to trust. Except you." The words hit Alina with visible force. She pressed a hand to her chest, struggling to contain the emotions flooding through her. "Me." But Mason cut her off gently. "You've been taking care of my children, taking care of me. And you've been doing it while fighting your own battle." His eyes locked with hers. "I heard everything about Luna." Alina froze, her face drained of color. "You heard that?" Mason nodded, every word. She turned away suddenly, ashamed, wiping her face quickly. "I didn't mean for you to know. I didn't want to add to your burden." Mason felt a surge of admiration. How could someone so overwhelmed still think about protecting others? "Alina," he said softly, "your daughter's pain isn't a burden, and neither are you." For the first time since he had woken in the hospital, Mason pushed himself to do something physical, lifting his hand and placing it gently over hers. The shock softened her expression, replacing fear with a fragile, aching hope. "I'm going to help her," he said. "I'm going to help you, starting now." Alina shook her head, tears falling freely. "No, Mr. Whitford, you can't." "I can't let you. You're not letting me," Mason said firmly. "I'm choosing this." He explained the plan in quiet, deliberate tones. He would authorize J.R. Keaton to withdraw funds discreetly, transferring enough for Luna's treatment without Ava ever knowing. Keaton was loyal. Mason had chosen him precisely because he didn't owe allegiance to the Whitford estate but to Mason himself. Alina covered her face with both hands, overwhelmed. "You resaving her," she whispered. "I don't know how to thank you." Mason squeezed her fingers lightly, his voice steady with conviction. "You've already done more for my family than Ava ever has. This is the least I can do." Alina sat beside him for a long moment, wiping tears and trying to regain composure. When she finally spoke, her voice was steadier. "What do you need me to do?" Mason breathed deeply, the partnership forming in real time. "I need information," he said. "Every conversation Ava has, every time Logan visits, anything they're replanning. You're the only one who can move freely around the house without raising suspicion." Alina nodded slowly. "Not out of obligation but out of loyalty and something deeper, something forged by shared suffering." "I'll help you," she said. "I'll do whatever it takes." In that moment Mason felt the shift, subtle yet monumental. He was no longer alone. Alina wasn't just an ally. She was the first real line of defense in the war Ava and Logan never realized they were about to lose. And as she rose from the chair, gently promising to return soon, Mason felt something he hadn't felt since before the crash: strength. The kind that comes from trust, the kind that grows from gratitude, the kind that changes the outcome of battles before they even begin. Alina's agreement to help marked the beginning of a subtle but powerful shift inside the Whitford mansion. It was the moment Mason transitioned from passive victim to quiet strategist, and Alina became the eyes and ears he didn't have. What made her so effective was that no one suspected her. Ava dismissed her entirely, viewing her as background noise, a piece of furniture that happened to breathe. Logan barely acknowledged her existence unless he needed something. That invisibility, once a burden, now became a weapon. The first morning after Mason revealed the truth, Alina entered his room with a changed energy. Her movements were the same, but her purpose was different: sharp, deliberate, quietly fueled by resolve. She tidied the blankets and checked the monitors as usual, but every so often, she leaned slightly closer than necessary, whispering updates through a calm expression. "Ava has a meeting at 11, she murmured, slipping the information into a sentence about adjusting the blinds with Logan. She told the nanny she'd be out most of the day. Mason listened, absorbing the details. What made Alina indispensable wasn't just her proximity to Ava, it was her intuition. She noticed things most people overlook: which folder Ava carried with her when she left the mansion, which rooms Logan inspected when he visited, how stressed Ava became whenever a particular attorney called. Alina didn't just report events, she connected them. She understood the psychology of the household in ways Mason never had, because she had spent years watching people who didn't bother watching her. That afternoon, Alina demonstrated her new awareness. Ava rushed into the home office, slamming drawers and muttering about missing documents. When Logan called minutes later, she practically hissed into the phone, "No, I can't find the financial statements. Someone must have moved them." Alina, dusting a nearby hallway, paused just long enough to catch the edge of the conversation. Later, she relayed it to Mason with the precision of someone who understood the value of every word. "She's worried," Alina whispered. "Not just annoyed, worried. Whatever those papers are, they matter." Mason felt something stirring inside him, anticipation. Fear too, but a different kind than before. This time, the fear was shared. He wasn't alone in the dark anymore, and that changed everything. In the days that followed, the quiet alliance deepened. Alina discreetly recorded conversations on her phone when Ava and Logan met behind closed doors. She noted dates, times, tones, and inconsistencies in their stories. She took photos of documents left carelessly on desks, receipts tucked into folders, handwritten notes Ava scribbled when stressed. Mason analyzed it all, building a timeline of betrayal with the accuracy of an engineer reconstructing an explosion. When he found a moment alone with Dr. Keaton during a scheduled examination, Mason spoke in low, strained whispers. Keaton checked his pulse and blood pressure with exaggerated slowness, giving the illusion of a standard visit, while his whispered responses remained neutral on the surface. "I need you to begin gathering records," Mason said, voice barely audible. "Financial, medical, legal, anything connected to Ava and Logan." Keaton nodded once, maintaining professional composure, and the fund transfer for Alina's daughter. Mason exhaled. "Do it quietly. No accounts tied to the Whitford estate. Use the trust fund I set aside for emergency humanitarian aid." Keaton glanced at his chart. Already in motion, Mason felt a wave of relief. Luna's chance at survival was no longer slipping away. As Keaton left the room, Alina entered again, carrying a basket of freshly laundered linens. Her eyes flickered with concern when she saw the strain on Mason's face. She lowered her voice. "Everything okay?" Mason nodded. "Keaton's helping. Luna's treatment is secure." Alina's shoulders sagged with gratitude, but she didn't break down again. She had transitioned from fragile to fierce in less than 24 hours. Her vulnerability wasn't gone, it was simply transformed into purpose. The alliance deepened even further that evening when Alina overheard something that altered the pace of their plan entirely. Ava and Logan were in the dining room, their conversation heated, too careless for the danger they were in. "The board is expecting the competency hearing next week," Logan snapped. "We need the signatures ready." Ava cursed under her breath. "I told you I'm working on it. His doctor keeps delaying paperwork. It's suspicious," Logan scoffed. "Then push him. He works for us." Ava didn't respond, meaning she had tried and failed. When Alina repeated those words to Mason later, he knew the timeline had accelerated. "They're trying to have me declared mentally incompetent," he said, the gravity thickening the air. "That gives them full control." Alina swallowed, her expression tightening. "What do we do?" Mason's response came with the controlled calm of a man who had built multimillion-dollar structures from chaos. "We get ahead of them." He told Alina to start gathering footage, anything that showed Ava's cruelty toward the children, her disregard for his care, her suspicious behavior with Logan. Not because he planned to use it immediately, but because someday soon he would need undeniable proof of her character in court. Mason also instructed Keaton to provide medical documentation that contradicted the claim of permanent cognitive impairment. They were constructing not just a defense, but an offensive strike. The deeper Alina involved herself, the more confident she became. She moved through the house with a heightened awareness, catching details she once ignored. She noticed that Ava always locked her office drawer after Logan visited. She realized Ava didn't want the children in certain hallways when lawyers came over. And most importantly, she discovered Ava had been shredding documents late at night, always right after heated phone calls. Each piece of information Alina delivered felt like ammunition, and Mason stored it meticulously. One night, Logan arrived unexpectedly. His voice carried the kind of low frustration that came from plans unraveling too slowly. "We need him gone," he muttered. "This half-alive state complicates everything." Ava hissed back, "I'm not killing him myself. Are you insane?" "Accidents happen twice," Logan replied coldly. "People don't question a death after trauma." Elena's breath caught where she stood hidden in the hallway. Mason listened to her recount the conversation with his pulse hammering, the threat now crashing into him with new clarity. They weren't just waiting, they were searching for their next opportunity. "Alina," Mason whispered, forcing calm into his voice, "from now on, you are not to be alone in this house with them. If they realize you helping me," she shook her head. "I'll be careful." He grabbed her hand weakly, urgency in his voice. "Careful won't be enough. They already killed once. I'm not letting them come near you." Her eyes softened and she squeezed his hand gently. "We'll get through this. You're not fighting alone." And for the first time in weeks, Mason believed it. He wasn't just surviving Ava and Logan anymore. He was outmaneuvering them quietly, intelligently, with a partner they underestimated entirely. The war Ava and Logan had begun was shifting. Their confidence had blinded them, and in that blindness, they had created the perfect conditions for their downfall. Every whispered update, every captured document, every overheard conversation was another brick in the case Mason was building against them. And soon the house of lies they constructed so carefully would start to crumble from the inside out. All because the one person they ignored, the one they saw as powerless, had become the most dangerous person in the entire mansion. The mansion felt different now, not because Ava or Logan had changed, but because Mason had. For weeks he had absorbed their cruelty, their arrogance, their murderous ambition. He had listened to their whispered schemes and shameless arguments, memorized their careless admissions, and watched their confidence swell as they believed they were closing in on the finish line. But what they didn't understand was that Mason Whitford had been rebuilding himself in the shadows. Every day spent lying still had honed his focus. Every overheard conversation had become a weapon. Every act of betrayal had become fuel. And now, finally, the moment was approaching, the moment he would rise, not as a victim, but as the man who had allowed his enemies enough rope to hang themselves with. The hearing that would declare him mentally incompetent was scheduled for 10 days out. Ava walked through the house with an energy that bordered on triumphant, arranging meetings, reviewing forged medical records, and practicing the sorrowful expression she intended to wear in court. Logan behaved even more boldly, issuing directives to company department heads as if his role had already been solidified. He told investors Mason's health would not improve, assuring them transition plans were underway. Their confidence might have intimidated most people, but to Mason, it was confirmation. They had no idea he was preparing to dismantle everything they had built on lies. Each night, after the household quieted and the children drifted to sleep, Alina entered Mason's room for whispered strategy sessions. She had become an expert at moving through the mansion without drawing attention, and she now carried a small notebook filled with dates, conversations, locations, and details too small for Ava to notice but too important for Mason to ignore. She logged which attorneys Ava contacted, which files she removed from drawers, how long she spent on each phone call, and how she behaved afterward. She even memorized the password Ava keyed into her laptop, a simple date Mason instantly recognized as the anniversary of the day Ava met Logan. Not him. The insult stung, but the usefulness outweighed the pain. With Alina's help, Mason pieced together a comprehensive map of every move Ava and Logan had made since the crash. He now knew when they transferred money, which shell companies they created, and which lawyers were willing to falsify paperwork for a cut of the inheritance. He even learned that Logan had begun negotiating with a larger tech firm to sell off divisions of the Whitford empire, something Mason had vowed never to do. These weren't just signs of betrayal, they were grounds for criminal charges. And Mason held every piece of evidence close, knowing the time to reveal them would be a single, devastating moment of exposure. Dr. Keaton visited regularly, playing his part flawlessly. To Ava, he was the slow, cautious physician delaying the competency paperwork out of professional uncertainty. To Mason, he was the linchpin of the plan. Keaton documented every sign of mental clarity Mason displayed during their private examinations: eye movement, muscle response, squeezed fingers, verbal attempts. He stored all footage off the Whitford servers under encrypted medical accounts Ava couldn't access. When Mason whispered that the hearing date was set, Keaton nodded with the calm of a man who understood exactly how high the stakes were. "You'll walk into that room on your own power," he said quietly, "and they won't see it coming." The first phase of Mason's return began with regaining physical strength. Every night after Alina confirmed Ava had left the property or gone to bed, Mason forced his body through grueling exercises. He lifted his arms, stretched his legs, clenched his hands, and practiced sitting up without triggering the monitors. Alina sometimes stood behind him, steadying his shoulders, her voice filled with encouragement and urgency. Slowly, she whispered, "You're redoing it. Keep going." He gritted his teeth through the pain, feeling strength returning inch by inch. He wasn't ready yet, not for confrontations, not for stares, not for sudden movement, but he was improving with every passing day. And as his body strengthened, so did his resolve. Meanwhile, Ava and Logan began growing impatient. Their conversations became sharper, more frantic. Logan was irritated that the final documents weren't ready. Ava worried that too many people were asking questions about Mason's health. "We need to finalize this," she snapped one evening. "The hearing has to go smoothly." Logan's answer made Mason's blood boil. "If he doesn't decline further soon," Logan said, "we might need to rethink how this ends." Alina reported this with trembling hands, fear in her eyes. Mason reached for her weakly, but intentionally. "It won't come to that," he assured her. "We'll beat them to it." The real turning point came when Alina managed to photograph a set of documents Ava left on the kitchen island papers outlining transfer of guardianship for Noah and Harper. Ava wasn't just planning to take the company. She wanted to take the children too, placing them under her legal authority before sending them away to a boarding school across the country. The betrayal struck Mason harder than anything before. He had expected greed, he had expected manipulation, he had expected cruelty. But taking his children, isolating them, stripping them from everything they knew was a level of malice he had not prepared for. That night Mason sat up fully for the first time, sweat pouring down his face from the effort. Alina steadied him, fear and pride mingling in her eyes. "You can't push yourself too hard," she murmured. "You need to be strong for the hearing." He nodded, breathless. "I'm doing this for them, for the kids. We end this before she gets anywhere near that paperwork." In the final days before the hearing, Mason orchestrated the finishing touches of his plan. Keaton secured affidavits, medical records, and signed statements proving Mason's coherence and improving condition. Alina captured audio recordings of Ava admitting to forging signatures and Logan referring to the break sabotage as Phase 1. Mason drafted a legal emergency motion with Keaton's help, ready to be submitted at the exact moment he revealed himself publicly. Everything was timed with precision. Ava spent the last evening before the hearing celebrating early victory, sipping wine on the balcony while Logan discussed which car he wanted to buy with his first executive bonus. Their laughter drifted through the house like nails scraping the walls. But upstairs, behind a closed bedroom door, Mason rose slowly from his bed, gripping the nightstand for balance. His legs trembled violently. Alina stood in front of him, hands hovering near his elbows, but she didn't touch him until he asked. "Are you ready?" she whispered. Mason straightened his posture, breathing through the pain. "I've never been more ready." He took one careful step, then another, each movement a promise, a warning, a countdown. Ava and Logan believed tomorrow would crown them victorious. But tomorrow would be the day their entire empire of deceit collapsed beneath them. Because Mason Whitford wasn't returning as the man they tried to bury. He was returning as the man who had learned exactly how to destroy them. The heart of this story delivers a powerful reminder about the fragile line between trust and betrayal, and how quickly the world can shift when the people you rely on reveal who they truly are. Mason Whitford built a life founded on partnership, loyalty, and the belief that those closest to him shared those values. But the attempt on his life revealed something darker, that sometimes the greatest danger isn't from strangers or competitors, but from the people invited into your inner circle. Ava and Logan show how greed erodes integrity one decision at a time. Their betrayal didn't begin the day the breaks were sabotaged. It began long before, in the quiet moments when selfishness outweighed empathy, when ambition silenced conscience, when envy buried gratitude. The story teaches that evil rarely arrives loudly. It grows in shadows, in unchecked desires, in small allowances made when morality feels inconvenient. Mason's tragedy becomes a lesson: trust should be earned, not assumed, and even the most successful, powerful people must remain vigilant about the intentions of those they allow into their lives. Yet the deeper lesson lies not just in recognizing betrayal, but in understanding the transformative power of adversity. Mason's near-death experience forces him into a position of complete vulnerability, physically broken, emotionally wounded, and trapped inside a home that had turned into enemy territory. But instead of collapsing under the weight of helplessness, he discovers resilience in a new form, one not built on dominance or influence, but on observation, patience, and inner strength. His recovery isn't simply a fight for survival, it becomes a rediscovery of who he is when the world strips everything away. He learns that strength is not always visible, that power sometimes lies in stillness, and that the mind can rise even when the body cannot. His forced silence becomes his greatest strategy, teaching him that sometimes the most powerful move is waiting, watching, and letting others expose themselves without ever realizing they are being observed. Another profound lesson emerges through Alina Ramirez, whose presence underscores the rare purity of genuine loyalty. In a house polluted by deception, she becomes the embodiment of compassion, steady, selfless, and unwavering, even while carrying her own personal heartbreak. Alina's struggle with her daughter's illness reveals the quiet bravery of those who keep giving even when their world is falling apart. Her role in the story shows that goodness often survives not because it is loud or forceful, but because it endures, choosing kindness even when surrounded by cruelty. Through Alina, the story teaches that love, integrity, and moral courage do not require power or status, they require heart. And sometimes the people society overlooks, the ones without wealth, influence, or recognition, are the ones who value loyalty the most. Mason learns that true allies are not the ones who flatter you in boardrooms or raise glasses during celebrations. They are the ones who show up when there is nothing to gain, when you have nothing to offer them but vulnerability. This leads to another central lesson: family is not just defined by blood or marriage, but by those who choose to stand with you when you have nothing left. Ava represents the danger of confusing proximity with partnership and commitment with possession. She married Mason for the life he built, not the man he was. Her love was conditional, fading the moment Mason stopped being useful. But Alina, without obligation, offered more devotion to Mason and his children than Ava ever had. The story reveals the unmistakable truth that real family rises in crisis while false loyalties crumble. Noah and Harper's bond with Alina shows that children recognize authenticity long before they can articulate it. And Mason's desire to protect Alina and Luna reflects how shared suffering creates deeper bonds than convenience or romance ever could. The family that emerges from this story is one built not on entitlement or expectation, but on love, sacrifice, and the courage to stand together against injustice. There is also a powerful commentary on the nature of greed. Ava and Logan represent a form of moral decay driven by entitlement, the belief that they are owed a life they never earned. Their obsession with wealth blinds them to the humanity of others. To them, Mason is not a husband or a partner, but a stepping stone. The children are not individuals with feelings, but obstacles. Money becomes their measure of worth, and in this pursuit they destroy themselves long before Mason ever lifts a finger to expose them. The story warns that greed doesn't just corrupt behavior, it corrupts identity. It teaches that when people prioritize power over people, they lose both. Logan, once successful on his own merits, loses everything because he traded integrity for ambition. Ava, who believed beauty and manipulation would secure her future, discovers that cruelty leaves a person with nothing worth keeping. Their downfall is not just a plot point, it is the inevitable consequence of living a life built on taking rather than giving. Finally, the story teaches a deeply human lesson about resilience and the reclamation of identity. Mason's journey from helplessness to empowerment symbolizes the rebirth that often follows life's darkest seasons. Trauma breaks us open, revealing who we truly are. Through his suffering, Mason discovers clarity about love, loyalty, fatherhood, and the dangers he once ignored. He rises not just to reclaim his company or expose his attempted murderers, but to protect the people he finally sees clearly: his children and the woman who helped keep his heart alive. His transformation reminds us that adversity doesn't merely destroy, it rebuilds. It forces the revaluation of priorities, the recognition of who matters, and the courage to begin again stronger than before. In the end, this story teaches that the worst betrayals can reveal the best truths, that darkness can sharpen purpose, that love, whether between parent and child, allies forged in hardship, or strangers bound by compassion, is ultimately more powerful than greed, and that no matter how carefully lies are constructed, the truth has a way of rising, just like Mason Whitford did, step by painful step, until he was strong enough to reclaim the life that had almost been stolen from him.
If you find this video helpful, don't forget to hit like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss upcoming videos. If you have any suggestions or questions, feel free to leave a comment below. I'd really love to hear your feedback. Thank you for watching until the end.